yesterday we went on the protest. I was quite intimidated by what had been said by Sunak and all the stories in the media about clamping down on these protesters. We've had on this show people who've been arrested for hissing in a council meeting last week. They were arrested and spent a whole day in custody. We've also spoken earlier on the show to Yale Khan, who was arrested and put into the police cell for most of a day for having a sign around her neck. You were arrested as well in November at a protest. Can you tell us what happened and why they arrested you and what happened when you were taken in by the police?
Sure. Thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me. I've been aware of your work for a long time. And I'll just say very briefly my story, which is not a unique story, but, I've been a political activist. I'm a surgeon in the National Health Service, but I've been a political activist since before I was a medical student. So it's just another aspect of my life, which is very important to me. And part of that, my father was an Indian. He was active in the Indian Workers Association, Brar. And, he was a lifelong supporter of the Palestinian people, as he was a supporter of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And the IWA, the Indian Workers Association, took those two matters to their heart and always campaigned on them, just as did the Labour movement and the broader working class in Britain in general. So I was at that demonstration. We have a book. It's a very nicely written book, actually by her pal, short pamphlet of the history of Zionism. And to the history of Zionism that not everyone perhaps is aware of, because it's not mentioned very prominently, but they're not made up, accusations. This is a historical fact, which is generally provable and known. There was an agreement between the German Zionist organization and the SS of the Nazi Party called the Havara, the transfer agreement, precisely because both organizations wanted to remove Jews from Europe and take them to Palestine for what was avowedly a colonial project from its outset. And so we've got a little book, a pamphlet, which illustrates that. And what we became aware of is that the police are working hand in hand with Zionist organizations in the demonstrations to try and pick people out and single them out for repression by the police. And there's a little Twitter site called @HurryUpHarry, Harry's Place. I don't know if you're aware of it.
I've seen it. Yeah, it's got a George Orwell picture, bizarrely, isn't it?
Yeah, it does. And so basically, they go around and during demonstrations, they try and get people think that they're speaking to an audience, so that they're going to, be putting arguments about the oppression of the Palestinian. But what this site is actually trying to do is get people to incriminate themselves unbeknownst to themselves. So they often ask, a bit like Piers Morgan, questions about Hamas, questions about October 7th, try and get you into a frame where you can fall foul of the legislation and then ask the police to crack down on you. Now, we haven't done any of that, but we just had this history book. They took offense to this history book and they essentially instructed the Met Police to come for us. So the Met Police, first of all, confiscated the book. And I've got a kind of a conversation about that in which I'm pointing out to the officers that this is political policing and that they're not quite understanding it. But it's an interesting conversation. And then they go away. And then half an hour later, they came back and said, oh, no, now we have to arrest you. And nothing had happened, but they said they're arresting us under Section 5 and Section 18 of the Public Order Act, which is threatening words and behavior. But they said, oh, but it's racially aggravated. So essentially, they were accusing us for racism for selling a history book giving the origins and history of Zionism. And ultimately, they took us to the police station. They kept us 24 hours. They raided our homes. There were 4 of us that they took.
Hold on a minute. Just that you were in prison in the police cell for 24 hours. You just kind of said, I mean, how was that? I mean, is that...
Well, the people that you've got, of course, are enforcing the repression, they haven't got a clue. They're politically, they don't know what they've been asked to do. They've been giving orders. They're following them out. Once they go through the unpleasantness of arresting you, because, I was manhandled, handcuffed, it's physically painful, undignified, and unjustified. So it constitutes an assault upon your person. So once you've gone through that and you've calmed down, from that point on, you're in their hands. They treat you very decently. And most of the people who look after you don't really know what's going on. They've got a way of processing you and all the rest of it. And eventually, a unit who are charged with the actual enforcement of whatever the accusation is come and see you and interview you. And I've got that recording of that interview. I think I'm going to release that on YouTube because it's very interesting as well, because they're very low level and they're trying to say, well, are you a racist? Were you trying to inflame racial hatred? And of course, they have no knowledge of the Palestinian conflict, how long it's been going on for, any of the background. They haven't read the book. That's what they really objected to. And I'll show you the front cover of the book. And the front cover of the book, some people would consider provocative precisely because it's got a visual reference to this Havara transfer agreement, which I think is quite central because these are ultra-nationalist ideologies. They also show that the relation of Israel to the oil state. They show some of the crimes of the IDF, including this very offensive T-shirt that IDF soldiers sold, which essentially is a sniper scope over a pregnant woman wearing hijab, because they always caricature, all the Palestinians as one Hamas and two extreme, ideological Muslims, and whatever you think of that, that's just a trope they have. So it's a pregnant woman anyway in a sniper scope, and the slogan is one shot, two kills. So they're glorifying within the army the concept of murder of Palestinians, Palestinian women, Palestinian babies, even in utero. So these are the well-known crimes of the IDF and its outlook. So it's that exposition that the Zionists took offense to. But the police, what's unusual is that if I tweet to the police and ask them to arrest a Zionist, they won't act, of course. But it seems that these Zionist groups have enough of a connection to the police and a part of that mechanism that they have been essentially asked to enforce political policing of what is a demonstration. So there's a concept that we have freedom of speech, freedom of criticism, but there's been a very active campaign to criminalize, and that really comes from governmental level, doesn't it? It comes from cabinet level and even prime ministerial level downwards, in order to say what we want to do is continue this job of, just as they did against Jeremy, really conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, being against the politics and actions of a far-right extremist group and a state which is currently, we're not sure even the numbers, definitely 30,000 killed, definitely 100,000 injured, but actually it's probably far more than that. And really, it's an extension of our other criticisms. But we documented very extensively at the time of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership our difference politically. I'm in a different group, CPG-BML. We are not of a Labour tradition, right? But we saw clearly that there was a huge groundswell of opinion in favour of Jeremy Corbyn when he was elected. People really were inspired. They very much hoped that Jeremy Corbyn would come to power, become the leader of a Labour government, a left-wing Labour government, and that would cause great change in the country. And quite clearly, lots of groups who thought that was possible got behind Jeremy. And I think, it was the Labour Party machine in conjunction with the state that really deprived him of, he definitely should have been our prime minister, I think, at his first election. I think that's quite clear. And it was around those issues that we really formed the Workers' Party to try and make a home. When I formed the Workers' Party initially with George. So all of those issues about, weaponizing anti-Semitism, not just to defend Israel, but actually to defend British imperialism, to defend the state against anyone who would threaten Britain's right to loot its colonies. It's very much the same part of the same project of the Iraq War, the destabilization of Libya, and all the things that we know about.
Can I just because I'm interested a little bit with the extent to which the police and the government, them being an agency of the government, kind of went into intimidating you. I mean, you were arrested for and detained for 24 hours?
Detained 24 hours. Then there were four of us, and they raided our homes. They took electronic equipment, laptops. They took some literature from our houses. And then eventually they interviewed us, and ultimately they had to release us, but they released us on bail conditions. And those bail conditions were, I'm not to distribute any literature at a demonstration. If I go to a demonstration, so I was allowed to go, but I can't deviate from the prescribed route of march. And then lastly, it was not to have any swastikas in public. But of course, a visual reference to someone else's ideology is not an approval of that ideology. And all of our history books are replete with those images. So that, but the idea was to kind of make it look as if I was a criminal and a far right activist, and just kind of politically questionable.
And of course, what about your employers as well? Is it true that the police had contacted your employers?
They did. So, and they're kind of quite slow to act. So initially off that, they didn't straight away. But actually, there was a subsequent demonstration on the 13th of January I attended, and in line with my bail restrictions, I just spoke. So I took a PA system, spoke to the crowd, but other people from my organization, of CPG-BML, they were there. And they were manning a stall, and then they were arrested, this time under charges of the Terrorism Act, because their leaflet essentially called for victory for the Palestinian resistance and their just war of liberation, which is kind of a leaflet we've been giving out for 20 years with slightly modified form. They said this essentially was the language of Hamas. It had a specific reference to this latest escalation in the conflict, which is a 100-year-old conflict or 75-year-old conflict, depending on how you look at it. And they said, because it mentioned Operation Al-Aqsa flood, which is not our name for it, but it's the name of this, operation. They said this is therefore giving support to Hamas, and therefore you're aiding and abetting a terrorist organization under Section 12 of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or actually it's just called the Terrorism Act 2000. This is punishable and can lead to a sentence of up to 14 years in jail. So I wasn't arrested then because I just was speaking and I walked away, but my comrades were. And I went the next day on the 14th of January to Hammersmith, where they were being held. And they were held for about 28, 30 hours, but I went there to try and get their release. And while I was there with my 4-year-old son, do nothing at all, again, peaceful, speaking to people, just hoping to get them out and welcome them out and show them our solidarity and support for what they've been doing. They sent more police. They kind of surrounded me from behind. I think they waited for a moment when I put my son down, in retrospect. And then there are about 10 or 12 police jumped me, handcuffed me, dragged me into the station again, and again charged me. This time, they said as the same offence as the one that my comrades inside had been arrested for terrorism. And again, it transpired that on both arrests, it had been this website, Harry's Place, who had essentially demanded the police act. And from outside the police station, it was Harry's Place who had contacted the police and told them I was there and I should be arrested. So they're literally, the police are being directed by political opponents of the Palestine solidarity movement to act really to criminalize protesters and in general the movement of support for Palestine.
But you've taken them on legally, and what's happened since?
So I mean, the second time they bailed me, this time they bailed me with very, very odd wording of their bail document, but essentially they said you just can't attend demonstrations. To the other comrades who were arrested, those three, they also said you can't leave the country and you can't enter the borough of Westminster. So it really was quite draconian bail conditions. The first charge now has been totally dropped, and that's this book. So this book is officially legal now. They've decided that there's nothing in it. They've gone through its contents. I'm sure they've read it page by page. It's all history. A lot of it history is the history of Jewish authors, Hannah Arendt and Lenny Brenner, or even the verdict of Israeli courts, because in the Rudolf Kastner case, both Eichmann and Kastner after World War II were tried. Eichmann was tried and Kastner was implicated in these courts. So all of them are, findings even of Israeli courts. So there's really nothing in it which is reprehensible. There's nothing in it that's racist. It's an anti-racist text, an anti-Zionist text, which exposes their history. So that's all been dropped. And for that reason, I think I will take the interview and I'll put it on YouTube because it's very worth watching. But immediately after the second arrest, they did contact my hospital. They contacted the GMC. And they, of course, what they do is they say you've been arrested twice, and they list all of the bail conditions, which when they put them all together, they look very sinister. Why is this man walking around with swastikas? Why is this man an anti-Semite? So they make you think that there must be something terrible about what I've been doing.
The police, the police.
The police, yeah, and the police have done that both to the GMC. The GMC passed it on to the hospital. The police actually called social services. I was very concerned for the safety of my son when they arrested me. They left him running around on a main street in London, in Hammersmith. And luckily, like my friends and comrades who were there, they look after him, so he was fine. But I didn't know that at the time. So I was remonstrating with the police, saying, where's my son? Look after my son. And then when they established he was okay, and he was with a friend of mine who's a teacher, I said, that's absolutely fine. And they kept on saying, no, we'll take him into social services. We'll take him in. And I managed to stop them doing that. And then later they contacted the social services and they said this was a child who was at risk because I was taking him into an unsafe environment. So the police put him in danger. And then they contacted the social services to try and put the social service onto my wife and child. So they've contacted my work. They've contacted the social services. They've essentially tried to, criminalize me. And actually, they don't have a legal leg to stand on. So we've had the first case thrown out entirely. The second case is still, we're awaiting. The bail date is on the 28th of March. We have to go back to Hammersmith Police Station. So we'll go back. And I'm quite sure that we'll get it all thrown out. But in the meantime, there's also been articles published about me in the Jewish Chronicle, in the Daily Telegraph. So these are large papers without, essentially hurling accusations about slightly separate things, but trying to say that there's something unbalanced or racist about some of my action, which absolutely there is not, right? And they hope that if you throw enough mud, some of it will stick, but maybe they'll get you sacked, they'll put you in a bad economic position, they can criminalize you. I'm still unable to attend demonstrations, so that has an impact on my ability to be where I want to be and express my political opinion in what should be, you would imagine, the democratic norms of society. So really,
Can I just
the
come in?
most.
Because I'm just thinking. I mean, I'm just thinking. You're a very articulate, very confident, professional surgeon. I mean, people's lives you save people's lives. I mean, you have a lot going for you in terms of not being intimidated as much as others. I mean, if someone didn't have your background, they could never get through this, could they? I mean, it's a really tough thing that you've gone through. I mean, you're talking about it in a kind of matter-of-fact way because you have that confidence and in yourself, but other people could never have tolerated what has happened to you.
Well, I think that's probably right. You're bitten off more than they can chew because I'm an activist. I'm a historian, really. I mean, it's like I'm an amateur historian, but I probably know more about history than I know about medicine because I've studied it. So I know that when I'm giving out the book, what I'm giving is fact. There's nothing reprehensible in it. And I know also that my government is complicit in the genocide, and even the leader of the opposition, essentially are speaking out in favor of the genocide, in favor of Israel. And precisely because, and that's not, and I don't have this idea that Israel is running Britain. I don't think that's right. I think Israel is a project of Britain. It was a project of Victorian politicians, and the Balfour Declaration is a sign of that. And they brought it into being, and they've used it, and they've transferred the chief responsibility over to the US. But as the junior partner of US imperialism, our government, our business elite, our political elite are very much, they're in this project up to the hilt because it's a means by which they loot the Middle East of oil and keep control over that geostrategically and economically extremely important area. But you're right, because I know all these things, I'm not intimidated by the accusation of being a racist. I mean, I'm someone who, I don't look at, I was born in this country, my mother's English, but my father's Indian. I've known racism. I know what racism is. I've been an anti-racist campaigner. So to be accused of being racism, I'm not Yale. I thought Yale's, case was again extremely powerful and articulate, precisely because how can you call a Jew who's the daughter of people who are literally in Auschwitz? How can you say that she's an anti-Semite? And yet that's the accusation that they're making. And so this is the stock in trade of Zionism, to weaponize anti-Semitism and to say that any criticism of Israel and its crimes is by definition racism, is anti-Semitism. And that's been adopted as a wider pattern and actually adopted by our ruling political class to deal with Jeremy and to get rid of him. And the Labour Party machine was absolutely complicit in that process.
I think I had to kind of unpick what you were saying because you're so confident that you kind of threw away things like you'd been in custody for 24 hours and they handcuffed you. And for me, I'd be saying they handcuffed me, they put me in custody. You didn't even kind of just throw it away. It's like,
I mean, it is amazing if you think that, armed terrorist police, so about 15 of them on the second occasion, came to my house. They kicked my wife, who's a surgeon, my 3 kids, my friend who's a teacher, her kid, all out of the house for their own safety, while they then walked away with a printer, black and white color printer, black and white printer, and a couple of leaflets after staying here for 15 hours. So, this is what you can see is even they, by the end, were bemused why they're being sent. They are people who think they're fighting terrorism, but are being used from a high political direction to actually repress political freedom of speech and expression. So I think that's the biggest take-home message that affects all of us. And very clearly, they're worried about the strength and vibrancy of the Palestine solidarity movement. So I would just say, everyone keep on doing what you're doing because it's having an effect. And I think ultimately, we can have victory. We can undermine their ability to wage this genocide and support this genocide. And it shouldn't be waged in our name.